The most devastating hit in Queens hip-hop history wasn't ordered by a rival gang, but by the executives at Def Jam and Tommy Boy. To execute the corporate assassination of Capone, the system didn't use a bullet. They waited for him to enter a prison cell and weaponized a recording contract. They flooded his childhood brother N.O.R.E. with millions in solo budgets, attaching a silent but lethal ultimatum to abandon his incarcerated partner or lose his newfound wealth. When Capone finally walked free, the landscape had shifted. His partner had become a solo superstar, and adapting to this new corporate dynamic would eventually strain their brotherhood. While two street legends tore their own empire apart, the corporate elites who engineered the betrayal safely collected the profits from their pristine boardrooms. In 1992, the borough of Queens was still staggering under the catastrophic weight of the crack cocaine epidemic. Neighborhoods like LaFrac City and Queensbridge were geographic islands of systemic neglect. The American government had effectively abandoned these zones, replacing social infrastructure with heavy-handed, aggressive policing. The inevitable byproduct of this environment was a relentless pipeline that funneled young working-class men directly into the state penal system. Survival in this ecosystem required a hardened exterior and an absolute non-negotiable reliance on your immediate circle. You did not survive Queens alone. It was within this brutal pipeline that Capone and N.O.R.E. first crossed paths. They did not meet at a talent showcase. They met inside the Collins Correctional Facility, a juvenile detention center in upstate New York. When you strip away a young man's freedom, his clothes, and his name, replacing them with a state-issued number, you strip away all superficial barriers. Prison forces a terrifying clarity upon the human mind. Inside Collins Correctional, alliances were not formed out of convenience. They were forged as a defense mechanism against a hostile environment. Capone and N.O.R.E. recognized a shared intelligence and a shared trauma in one another. They were both sharp, highly observant, and deeply resentful of the socioeconomic trap that had landed them behind bars. Playing basketball in the prison yard, sharing the monotonous, humiliating routine of state custody, they developed a profound parity. They were absolute equals. Neither man was the leader, neither was the follower. They were two sides of the same coin, bonded by the shared goal of surviving their sentences and escaping the cycle of institutionalization. This parity is crucial to understanding the tragedy that followed. The corporate music industry is built on hierarchy, lead singers and backup dancers, stars and sidekicks. But the foundation of CNN, Capone-N-Noreaga, was built on absolute symmetrical equality. When they were released and returned to the streets of Queens, they took the trauma of their incarceration and weaponized it into music. They did not create escapist fantasy rap. They recorded audio documentaries. Their lyrical content was a raw, unfiltered transmission from the underbelly of New York. It was paranoid, it was violent, and it was entirely authentic. The industry, constantly hungering for the next visceral thrill to sell to middle-class America, quickly took notice. By 1996, the duo had successfully transitioned from the illicit street economy to the corporate music economy. They signed a deal with Penalty Records, operating under the massive distribution umbrella of Tommy Boy Records. They were ushered into expensive studios to record their debut album, The War Report. For two young men who had spent their formative years locked in a juvenile facility, this felt like total victory. They believed they had beaten the system. They believed that their talent and their unbreakable brotherhood had finally secured them a seat at the table. They were catastrophically naive about the nature of the table they were sitting at. The music industry operates under the illusion of partnership, but it is, at its core, an extraction industry. The executives at Tommy Boy and the surrounding corporate infrastructure, driven by figures who viewed street culture purely through the lens of quarterly earnings, looked at Capone and N.O.R.E. and saw highly lucrative yet highly volatile investments. The executives understood the backgrounds of these young men. They knew about the arrests, the gang affiliations, and the legal vulnerabilities. But the boardroom does not care about the rehabilitation of young black men. It cares about risk management. In 1997, just as the war report was being finalized and poised to dominate the cultural landscape, the structural trap of the American justice system snapped shut. Capone was arrested on a parole violation connected to a previous weapons charge. The swiftness of the judicial system was staggering. He was rapidly processed, convicted, and handed a devastating sentence of just under 3 years. The psychological whiplash of this event is difficult to articulate. Imagine standing on the absolute precipice of generational wealth. You have recorded a masterpiece. You can see the trajectory of your life shifting from poverty to immense power. And in the span of a single afternoon, a judge's gavel shatters that reality, sending you back to the exact same cell block you swore you would never see again. Capone was stripped of his newfound corporate status and reduced once more to property of the state. He was locked away, forced to sit in a cinder block room while the album he co-created was shipped to record stores across the globe. But the true cruelty of 1997 did not occur in the courtroom. It occurred in the boardrooms of Manhattan. When the news of Capone's incarceration reached the executives at Tommy Boy Records, there was no mourning. There was no discussion of how to support their artist through a difficult legal battle. There was only a cold, immediate reassessment of assets. An incarcerated artist is a dead asset. He cannot shoot promotional videos. He cannot appear on MTV. He cannot embark on a nationwide tour. From a strictly capitalist perspective, Capone had instantly depreciated to zero. The executives immediately convened to restructure their investment. The war report was generating massive momentum. The street buzz was deafening. The label had a product that was guaranteed to sell, but they only had half a group to market it. They looked at Victor Santiago Jr. sitting alone in the studio, reeling from the sudden loss of his partner. To the boardroom, N.O.R.E. was the solution. He was highly charismatic, possessing a frantic, magnetic energy that translated perfectly to the camera. He was raw, but he was moldable. Most importantly, he was free. The corporate machine recognized a fleeting window of opportunity. They needed to capitalize on the momentum of the war report before the public moved on to the next trend. They could not wait 3 years for Capone to finish his sentence. The industry moves too fast. The executives made a calculated, ruthless decision. They would legally and financially amputate Capone from the operational future of the brand. They would take the entire promotional budget, the tour support, and the marketing machinery that was intended for CNN, and they would reroute it entirely into N.O.R.E. They did not present this to N.O.R.E. as a betrayal. They presented it as an emergency survival tactic. They pulled a young man who had just lost his closest friend into a room filled with lawyers and accountants, and they laid out the stark reality of corporate patronage. They explained that the momentum of the album would die if he did not step up and carry the brand alone. They offered to flood him with resources, to put him in rooms with the most expensive producers in the world, and to make him a household name. They weaponized his ambition against his loyalty. They knew N.O.R.E. had a family to feed. They knew the terrifying proximity of the poverty he had just escaped. They placed a bag of money on the table thick enough to build a new life, and they attached a silent, lethal condition. The contract did not explicitly state that he must abandon Capone. It didn't have to. The mechanics of the industry dictated that by accepting the solo push, by monopolizing the label's attention and resources, he was structurally leaving his partner behind in the dark. As 1997 drew to a close, the divide was officially engineered. The war report hit the streets and became a monumental success, universally hailed as a cornerstone of East Coast hip-hop. But the victory was hollow. N.O.R.E. was thrust onto stages alone, performing verses meant for two, absorbing the adoration of crowds while carrying the heavy, unspoken guilt of survival. And in a state penitentiary in upstate New York, Chaim Hawley sat on a steel bunk, listening to his own voice on the prison radio. He watched his brother morph into a solo superstar on the communal television screen. The physical distance between them was only a few hundred miles, but the corporate machinery had already placed them in two entirely different universes. The seed of resentment was planted in the concrete, watered by the silence of the executives, and waiting for the day Capone would finally walk free. The year 1998 marked the absolute divergence of two lives that were supposed to run parallel. While Chaim Capone Hawley navigated the hyper-violent, strictly regimented reality of the New York State penal system, Victor N.O.R.E. Santiago Jr. was being systematically processed through a different kind of institution, the star-making machinery of the corporate music industry. The executives at Tommy Boy Records had made their risk assessment, and they moved with the clinical, unfeeling efficiency of a surgical team amputating a dead limb to save the host. The host in this scenario was the profit margin. The limb was Capone. To execute this separation, the label did not employ coercion. They employed overwhelming financial force. They understood a fundamental psychological truth about young men who have survived extreme poverty. If you wish to buy a man's loyalty, you do not hand him a steady salary. You drown him in capital. You change his entire socio-economic reality overnight, effectively terrifying him into compliance through the sheer fear of losing his new lifestyle. The corporate machine greenlit N.O.R.E.'s eponymous debut solo album. This was not presented to him as a permanent departure from his partner, but rather as a strategic placeholder, a way to keep the brand alive while Capone served his time. It was a masterful, calculated deception. The label aggressively recruited the most innovative and expensive production talent in the industry. They paired N.O.R.E. with a relatively new, highly futuristic production duo from Virginia known as the Neptunes, comprised of Pharrell Williams and Chad Hugo. The result of this collaboration was Super Thug. It was not merely a hit record, it was a cultural phenomenon that fundamentally shifted the sonic landscape of East Coast hip-hop. The track propelled N.O.R.E. out of the regional, gritty underground of Queens and onto the global stage. He was no longer just a street rapper. He was an international commodity. The music video was placed on heavy rotation on MTV. The album sold hundreds of thousands of copies within weeks, rapidly approaching platinum status. The revenue streams transformed from a steady trickle into a torrential flood. This is where the psychological trauma of the survivor begins to mutate. N.O.R.E. was suddenly thrust into a completely alien environment. He was moved out of the dangerous neighborhoods of his youth and placed into luxury condominiums. He was surrounded by a newly assembled team of handlers, managers, publicists, accountants, and corporate sycophants whose sole occupational purpose was to keep the primary asset happy and productive. This ecosystem is designed to be an echo chamber. When you are the center of a multi-million-dollar enterprise, the people on your payroll do not challenge your decisions, and they certainly do not encourage you to look back at the liabilities you left behind. The executives understood that guilt is a heavy, distracting emotion. To keep N.O.R.E. focused on generating revenue, they had to actively isolate him from the reality of his incarcerated partner. They filled his schedule with relentless touring, promotional appearances, and studio sessions. They kept him exhausted, wealthy, and completely insulated from the streets. When a man is moving at the speed of light, he rarely has the time to look in the rearview mirror. Meanwhile, time moves differently inside a prison cell. For Capone, the year 1998 was a slow, agonizing psychological torture. The contrast between his physical reality and the reality being broadcast through the media was severe enough to fracture a man's sanity. He was subjected to the daily degradations of state custody, strip searches, terrible food, the constant threat of violence, and the oppressive, suffocating routine of confinement. Yet every time he walked through the prison day room, he saw the face of his closest friend dominating the television screens. Initially, Capone likely viewed N.O.R.E.'s solo success with a sense of collective pride. In the code of the streets, a victory for one is a victory for the unit. He assumed that N.O.R.E. was holding the fort, accumulating the capital and the leverage required to relaunch CNN upon his release. But as the months dragged on, the insidious nature of the corporate divide began to manifest in the form of silence. The letters from the outside began to slow down. The phone calls, which required navigating the archaic, expensive prison telecommunication system, became shorter and less frequent. N.O.R.E. was always in a studio, always on a plane, always dealing with a crisis manufactured by the label. The handlers were doing their job. They were building a firewall between the superstar and the convict. For Capone, the silence was louder than a physical blow. The street code dictates that when your brother falls, you carry his weight. You ensure his commissary account is full. You provide for his family on the outside. Most importantly, you keep his name alive. While N.O.R.E. frequently shouted out Capone on his records, the financial and emotional support necessary to sustain a man surviving the penal system began to critically erode. Capone was not just losing his freedom, he was watching the erasure of his identity. He was becoming a footnote in another man's success story. The executives at the record label watched this divergence with quiet satisfaction. From a logistical and economic standpoint, a solo artist is an infinitely superior product compared to a duo, A solo act requires only one hotel room, one flight, and one set of handlers. More importantly, it requires only one royalty split. The label recognized that N.O.R.E. was highly profitable on his own. Bringing Capone back into the equation upon his release would not double their profits. It would simply force them to divide the existing revenue stream and reintroduce a volatile, street-oriented element into a now sanitized, highly lucrative pop rap formula. The boardrooms had already made their decision long before Capone's release date was even finalized. The CNN brand was dead to them. N.O.R.E. was the future. The corporate objective shifted from managing a duo to actively preventing their reunion. They began to subtly manipulate N.O.R.E.'s perception of his own value. They fed his ego, reinforcing the narrative that he was the true star, the singular talent who had carried the weight of the War Report legacy. They planted the seed that Capone's incarceration was not a shared tragedy, but a personal failure that had jeopardized N.O.R.E.'s livelihood. They systematically converted the street loyalty N.O.R.E. once possessed into corporate pragmatism. They convinced him that protecting his newfound wealth was the only logical, responsible course of action. By the end of 1998, the psychological conditioning was nearly complete. N.O.R.E. had transitioned from a loyal soldier of Queens into a corporate asset fiercely protective of his solo brand. He had tasted the absolute pinnacle of commercial success, and the system had terrified him into believing that returning to a partnership would dilute his power and risk his financial security. As the winter of early 1999 approached, a stark, unavoidable reality loomed on the horizon. Capone-Hawley had served his time. The state of New York was preparing to open the gates and release him back into society. To the fans of East Coast hip-hop, this impending release signaled the glorious, long-awaited return of the most authentic duo in the industry. It was supposed to be a triumphant homecoming, but the corporate executives were already drafting the contracts of exclusion. They had built a multi-million-dollar fortress around N.O.R.E., and they had no intention of lowering the drawbridge for a man returning from a prison cell with empty pockets and a rightful claim to half the kingdom. The stage was meticulously set, not for a reunion, but for one of the most brutal, humiliating public betrayals in the history of the music business. The system had primed the weapon. All that was left was to force N.O.R.E. to pull the trigger. When the heavy iron gates of the New York State penal system finally opened in early 1999, Capone-Hawley stepped out into a brutal, disorienting reality. For a man who had spent the last several years surviving the hyper-vigilant, sensory-deprived environment of a prison cell, freedom is supposed to feel like a resurrection. Capone expected to walk into the open arms of his brother. He expected the traditional homecoming of a street general. The luxury vehicles idling by the curb, the thick gold chains, and the immediate handover of the keys to the empire they had built together. He had sacrificed his freedom, taking a sentence without cooperating with the authorities, adhering strictly to the code of silence that governed their neighborhood. He believed that this loyalty was a deposit in a bank that N.O.R.E. was safeguarding. He was entirely wrong. There was no grand homecoming. The bank had been looted and the locks had been changed. The initial shock did not come from a dramatic, screaming confrontation. It came in the form of a chilling, administrative distance. When Capone finally secured a meeting with the N.O.R.E., it did not take place on the block in Queens where they had once shared their last dollars. It took place in a sterilized corporate environment, heavily mediated by the very handlers the label had installed to protect their primary asset. Capone looked at the man he had shared a juvenile cell with, and he did not see his absolute equal. He saw a highly manicured corporate product. N.O.R.E. was flanked by managers, publicists, and sycophants who looked at Capone with thinly veiled hostility. To them, Capone was not a returning hero. He was a financial parasite attempting to latch onto their golden goose. The conversation that followed was the ultimate execution of the corporate mandate. N.O.R.E. did not leverage his massive solo success to demand a lucrative new contract for CNN. He did not threaten to withhold his own music until his partner was compensated. Instead, he parroted the exact talking points drafted by the executives in the boardrooms of Tommy Boy and Def Jam. Despite the fact that N.O.R.E. had kept Capone's name alive in his music, the transition back to a duo was abruptly complex. The label was heavily invested in N.O.R.E. as a solo act, creating an immediate friction regarding how and when CNN would be prioritized again. To fully grasp the psychological devastation of this moment, one must analyze the unique humiliation inflicted upon a returning prisoner. When a man is released from the penal system, his self-esteem is already dangerously fragile. He possesses a felony record, which legally bars him from participating in the traditional American economy. His only viable pathway to survival, his only legal currency, was his equity in the CNN brand. The corporate machine, acting through N.O.R.E., systematically stripped him of that equity. They told a man who had co-authored a certified hip-hop classic that his contributions were obsolete. They reduced him to a beggar in his own kingdom. Capone was thrust into a state of economic starvation. His music, the verses he wrote before he went to prison, was still playing out of the windows of every passing car in New York. His voice was generating millions of dollars in revenue for the distribution companies. Yet he was walking the streets of Queens with empty pockets, forced to ask for handouts to survive. The juxtaposition of extreme cultural relevance and absolute financial ruin is a specific kind of psychological torture designed by the music industry to break a rebellious spirit. They did not just want to sideline Capone, they wanted to humiliate him so profoundly that he would surrender any legal or moral claim to the empire. The emotional fallout of this rejection rapidly mutated into a volatile, uncontrollable rage. Capone realized that the street code, the very foundation upon which they had built their music and their lives, was entirely meaningless to the men in the tailored suits, and shockingly, it was now meaningless to N.O.R.E. When cornered by a system that refuses to acknowledge your existence, the only recourse left for a man forged in poverty is to make noise. However, the emotional fallout of this corporate division initially strained their relationship strictly behind closed doors. While the streets whispered about the tension, the public explosion would not happen until much later. As 1999 bled into 2000, the economic embargo placed upon Capone achieved its grim, inevitable outcome. A man returning from a maximum security prison cannot simply wait patiently for a corporate entity to find him profitable again. He has to eat. He has to survive. stripped of his recording budgets, blocked from major touring circuits, and alienated from the momentum his partner was generating, Capone was pushed to the absolute brink. The system had successfully engineered a trap from which there was no legal escape. The American criminal justice system and the corporate music industry operate in a terrifying, unspoken symbiosis. The executives know that if you financially starve a felon, you do not have to worry about him launching a costly legal battle for his royalties. You simply wait for his desperation to force him back into the illicit street economy. It is a self-cleaning mechanism for disposing of unwanted human assets. Capone, facing total financial collapse, was forced back into the dangerous proximity of the very lifestyle that had stolen his freedom in the first place. While he fought for his daily survival in an environment that heavily policed him, the man who had sold him out was flying on private jets funded by the legacy they had built together. The psychological toll of this era fundamentally altered the trajectory of both men. For N.O.R.E., the wealth and the fame could not completely silence the underlying guilt of his capitulation. He had the corporate backing, but he had lost the unconditional respect of the purists and the unwavering loyalty of his hometown. He was an incredibly successful, highly isolated pawn. For Capone, the betrayal permanently hardened him. It eradicated any lingering naivety about the nature of the music business. He learned the hardest lesson a man can learn. In the eyes of capitalism, brotherhood is merely a marketing tool, easily discarded the moment it ceases to generate a maximum return on investment. The destruction of the CNN alliance was not a tragic accident. It was a flawless, brutal execution of corporate strategy. But the system was not done. The executives had squeezed the immediate value out of the separation, but they still owned the rights to the brand. As the new millennium dawned, the corporate machine would initiate the final, most cynical phase of their operation, proving that they could not only destroy a friendship for profit, but that they could also force the shattered pieces back together when it suited their financial agenda. The illusion of corporate permanence is the most dangerous drug the American entertainment industry peddles to its young working-class stars. As the late 1990s bled into the new millennium, Victor N.O.R.E. Santiago Jr. was heavily intoxicated by this illusion. He had executed the brutal mandate handed down by the executives, sacrificing his brotherhood with Capone to secure his position as a solo superstar. He believed that this obedience had purchased him a permanent seat at the table. He believed that because he had proven his willingness to prioritize the label's profit margins over his own moral compass, the corporate machine would reward him with unending loyalty. He was entirely mistaken. Capitalism has no memory, and it certainly has no gratitude. By the year 2000, the tectonic plates of the hip-hop industry were shifting violently. The novelty of the super thug era was beginning to wane. The market was suddenly flooded with new sounds from the American South and the Midwest, and the executives in the high-rises of Manhattan were constantly recalibrating their portfolios to chase the next lucrative demographic trend. N.O.R.E. slowly began to experience the terrifying silent chill of corporate cooling. The massive promotional budgets that had been readily available for his solo debut began to shrink. The executives who used to return his calls within minutes were suddenly trapped in endless meetings. The machinery was not turning against him aggressively. It was simply powering down, preparing to redirect its energy towards newer, more easily manipulated assets. It was during this period of declining solo momentum that the boardrooms experienced a cynical revelation. The executives looked at their quarterly projections and realized that N.O.R.E. as a solo act was experiencing diminishing returns. However, market research and street-level data indicated a massive, untapped reservoir of nostalgia for the original CNN brand. The public wanted the grittiness of the war report. They wanted the dynamic tension of the duo. The very same executives who had ruthlessly engineered the separation of Capone and N.O.R.E. 3 years prior suddenly decided that a reunion was the most mathematically sound strategy for their next fiscal quarter. They did not orchestrate this reunion out of a sudden desire to heal a fractured friendship or to right a historical wrong. They orchestrated it because the algorithms of profit demanded it. The mechanism used to force this reunion is a masterclass in psychological manipulation and financial coercion. With their Tommy Boy contract fractured, the duo was ushered into a new deal with Def Jam Records, but the corporate playbook remained identical. The new executives approached Capone, a man deliberately starved of resources, blacklisted from major distribution, and pushed to the absolute edge of survival. They did not offer him an apology. They offered him an advance. To a man who has been fighting for his economic life on the streets, an advance from a major record label is not a contract. It is a lifeline. They weaponized his desperation, knowing he was in no position to demand equitable terms or to demand accountability for the years of neglect. Simultaneously, they approached N.O.R.E., a man whose solo career was beginning to show fatal cracks. They subtly communicated that the massive solo budgets were a thing of the past, but a CNN reunion album would guarantee a massive promotional push. They boxed him into a corner. They had isolated him from his brother to make him a star, and now they were forcing him back into the partnership because his solo star was fading. The resulting album, appropriately but cynically titled The Reunion, was released in the year 2000. To the untrained eye, it looked like a triumphant overcoming of adversity. The press releases heralded the return of the Kings of Queens, but behind the closed doors of the recording studios, the reality was bleak, claustrophobic, and entirely devoid of the magic that had created their debut. You cannot surgically extract a man's loyalty, leave him to rot in poverty, and then expect him to seamlessly harmonize with you on a microphone just because a lawyer drafted a new agreement. The studio sessions for the reunion were loaded with underlying tension. While they were glad to be recording together again, they were no longer just two kids fighting the world. They were navigating the heavy expectations of a label looking to capitalize on their highly anticipated return. The parody was gone. The absolute trust required to create authentic art had been completely eradicated. Capone was standing in the vocal booth with the man who had abandoned him, fully aware that he was only there because the label needed his credibility to sell records. He had to swallow his pride, suppress his entirely justified rage, and perform the role of the loyal partner in order to secure the check he needed to survive. This is the deepest, most insidious form of trauma inflicted by the music industry. It forces an artist to actively participate in the commodification of their own humiliation. Capone had to sell the illusion of brotherhood to a public that did not care about the internal agony it cost him to smile for the camera. For N.O.R.E., the reunion album was an exposure of his own powerlessness. He realized that he had burned his most valuable human connection for a system that ultimately viewed him as a disposable utility. He had played by the corporate rules. He had betrayed his partner. And the reward was a stark realization that he was still just a pawn on the board. The executives could separate him, and they could force him back together, pulling his strings with total impunity. The fans, operating on the instinctual level that defines street culture, could hear the fracture in the music. The reunion sold moderately well, entirely off the fumes of the brand's legacy, but it lacked the visceral, unified soul of the War Report. It sounded exactly like what it was, a transactional obligation. Once the album was delivered and the initial burst of revenue was collected, the corporate machine executed its final devastating maneuver. Having successfully extracted the last remaining drops of capital from the CNN brand, the executives simply walked away. They did not renew the massive contracts. They did not fund subsequent tours. The promotion completely vanished. The label had successfully milked the controversy of the separation and the nostalgia of the reunion, and now they were finished with the product. Capone and N.O.R.E. were left standing in the ruins of their own empire. The zero-sum game had reached its natural conclusion. They had spent years engaged in a bitter, engineered civil war. They had degraded themselves publicly. They had lost the absolute prime of their artistic careers. And what was the prize? They had both been unceremoniously discarded by the very system that had promised them the world. The working-class youths of Queens had been pitted against each other, incentivized to destroy their own solidarity, all while the executives who orchestrated the violence quietly secured their bonuses and moved on to the next vulnerable demographic. N.O.R.E. finally experienced the exact same cold, administrative abandonment that he had watched the label inflict upon Capone years earlier. He learned the hardest lesson of capitalism. The men who pay you to betray your brother will eventually betray you, because loyalty is not a line item on a balance sheet. As the early 2000s progressed, the two men were forced to navigate a profoundly hostile industry without the protection of a major label and without the genuine bulletproof brotherhood they had once shared. They were isolated, carrying the deep psychological scars of men who had seen the absolute top of the mountain, only to realize that the mountain itself was a trap. The executives had won. They always win. They had taken two raw, authentic voices from the streets, turned their pain into millions of dollars, and left them with nothing but the haunting echo of the betrayal they were forced to enact upon each other. The silence that follows a corporate execution is profound. It is not the sudden, violent silence of a gunshot. It is the slow, suffocating silence of a disconnected phone line. In the years immediately following the manufactured reunion of CNN, Capone and N.O.R.E. found themselves navigating a wasteland. The major labels had extracted the last remaining drops of cultural capital from their shared legacy, and the executives had simply turned off the lights and walked out of the room. The transition into the mid-2000s marked a terrifying new reality for two men who had once commanded the absolute attention of the global music industry. They were no longer the priority. They were no longer the vanguard. They were independent contractors abandoned in a rapidly shifting economy, forced to survive the wreckage of their own engineered civil war. The corporate machine is engineered with a specific, ruthless appetite. It consumes the energy, the pain, and the authenticity of youth. It possesses absolutely no infrastructure for the rehabilitation or the preservation of its aging veterans. It has absolutely no infrastructure for the rehabilitation or the preservation of its aging veterans. Once the labels withdrew their massive marketing budgets and their political protection, Capone and N.O.R.E. were left to confront the devastating reality of the zero-sum game they had been manipulated into playing. They had sacrificed their prime creative years, their street credibility, and their unbreakable brotherhood, fighting over a corporate pie that was ultimately eaten by the executives who baked it. The divergence in their survival tactics during this period exposes the brutal demographic calculus of the music business. N.O.R.E., hyper-aware that the traditional hip-hop executives had effectively discarded him, executed a desperate, brilliant pivot. He recognized that the door to mainstream East Coast rap had been locked from the inside. To survive, he had to find a completely new market, an ecosystem untainted by the executives who had engineered his rise and fall. He leaned heavily into his Puerto Rican heritage and became one of the pioneering figures to bring reggaeton into the American mainstream with the massive 2004 hit, Oye Mi Canto. To the public, this looked like an artist reinventing himself, but analyzed through the lens of corporate trauma, it was the frantic maneuver of a man running for his economic life. N.O.R.E. had to entirely change his sound, his demographic target, and his cultural alignment just to secure a paycheck that did not require the approval of the men who had forced him to betray Capone. He found a back door out of the burning building, but the escape required him to leave the foundational sound of Queens behind. Capone did not have a demographic backdoor. He was fundamentally anchored to the gritty, uncompromising reality of New York street rap, a subgenre that the major labels were rapidly abandoning in favor of the more commercially viable club-oriented sounds emerging from the American South. The system had typecast him as a liability in 1997, and the industry refused to update that assessment. He was forced into the grueling, unforgiving grind of the independent circuit. The psychological burden placed upon Capone during these years is difficult to measure. He had to perform the classics from the War Report in small clubs and independent venues, reciting lyrics that chronicled an empire that had been stolen from him while he sat in a prison cell. He was a living artifact of a golden era, carrying the physical and emotional scars of a man who had done everything right by the street code, only to be utterly destroyed by the corporate code. He watched younger artists adopt his flow, his slang, and his aesthetic, securing the multi-million-dollar deals that were rightfully his. The industry had strip-mined his identity and then barred him from the marketplace. As the decade wore on, the distance between the two men forced a quiet, painful introspection. The anger that had fueled their public feud slowly burned itself out, replaced by a cold, heavy exhaustion. When two men are battered by the exact same system, the animosity eventually gives way to a grim, shared understanding. The reconciliation between Capone and N.O.R.E. did not occur rapidly, and it was not brokered by record label executives looking for a quick cash grab. It happened slowly away from the cameras, in the quiet reality of middle age, when they finally sat down as mature men, fathers, who had survived the meat grinder. The conversation fundamentally shifted. They stopped blaming each other for the decisions made in the late 1990s. They looked past the individual betrayals and recognized the architecture of the trap that had been set for them. N.O.R.E. had to confront the agonizing reality that his compliance had been bought, that he had allowed the terror of poverty to override his loyalty. Capone had to process the fact that his rage, while entirely justified, had been weaponized by the media to entertain the masses and absolve the corporations. Forgiveness in this context is a terrifying undertaking. It requires you to admit that you were a pawn. It requires you to look at the brother who sold you out and recognize that he only did it because the system held a gun to his economic survival. They forgave each other, but the tragedy of their story is that forgiveness does not restore the lost millions. It does not give you back your 20s. It does not rebuild the shattered infrastructure of the Queens neighborhoods that tore themselves apart fighting over a manufactured beef. You can glue the pieces of a fractured brotherhood back together, but the vase will never hold water the same way again. It will always bear the visible cracks of corporate intervention. Capone and N.O.R.E. survived. They are respected as legends, pioneers of a sound that defined an era. Today, N.O.R.E. has successfully reinvented himself as a media mogul, hosting a highly successful podcast, finally taking ownership of his own narrative and distribution. Capone remains a highly respected, uncompromising voice of the streets, a testament to the resilience of a man who refused to let the system entirely erase him. They beat the odds by simply staying alive in an industry designed to kill them. But their survival does not negate the crime that was committed against them. The executives recognize that two young men, bound by the trauma of a prison cell and the absolute loyalty of the street code, were too powerful to control. So they introduced the only weapon capable of piercing that armor: corporate capital. Capone and N.O.R.E. conquered their environment, only to be outmaneuvered by the cold mechanics of the music industry. The corporate push for a solo star inherently fractured the duo's foundation, proving that in the recording business, individual profit will always be leveraged against collective loyalty. In the final accounting, the moral of the story is brutal, stark, and entirely devoid of a Hollywood ending. When the marginalized are handed a knife and paid to cut each other's throats, the only entity that walks away without blood on its hands is the system that purchased the blade.